No one's sure where precisely the American piano great Dave Brubeck first met Edward Saldana. Perhaps it was at the Ambassador Hotel on Churchgate Street in Bombay, where the young pianist performed every night. Or maybe it was at the Eros Ballroom on April the 7th, 1958. A fading photo in Saldana's scrapbook shot at the dance hall after a music seminar that morning shows the Indian musician in his Sunday best, standing shyly between Brubeck and the saxophonist Paul Desmond. There's a cloud of nervousness about him, suggesting the anxiety of a fan who's finally being ushered into the presence of a long admired idol. The way you see Jerry sort of when he looks at Shanta Gokhale, for instance, and enters her presence. Uh, there's no ambiguity about the outcome of that encounter, though. Brubeck was so impressed by Saldana's talent, he arranged a scholarship for the Indian musician to attend the prestigious Berklee School of Music in Boston. 23 years after a violinist from Minnesota named Leon Abbey had brought the first African American jazz band to India, Edward Saldana, who had already won legends of fans under the stage name Dizzy Sal, would become the first Indian to play jazz at important venues in the US, even going on to cut a well regarded record. But then his dreams began to darken. After he returned to India a few years later, Sal barely performed again. At first, Bombay's chatty jazz fans had several theories about this. Their speculation revolving around the specific nature of a mysterious illness with which they believed the pianist had come to be afflicted. But as Sal's silence became so prolonged, they all but forgot about him. By the time he died in 1998, the only traces that remained of Dizzy Sal's quest to conquer America were a jumble of old newspaper clippings, passing references to him in the memoirs of famous American jazzmen, and the small type credits of their early discographies. On the weekend of his 90th birthday in 2010, I had the opportunity to interview Dave Brubeck, and he couldn't remember many specific details about the Indian musician. But he was emphatic about one thing. Dizzy Sal was a very good pianist, he said. As you can see from this photograph, or the previous one, Brubeck is a mild, studious looking chap. But he was actually an American secret weapon. As the Cold War raged between the US and the Soviet Union, both sides were determined to win over the people of the third world, which is to say the colored peoples of the planet. Some of them got sent off to universities in Hawaii. But culture was an important part of that strategy. There was a dig to two people at the back of the room, but they haven't even cracked a smile yet. Now he has. The Soviets sent the Kirov Ballet on tour to convince Africans and Asians that communism was far superior to capitalism. And the US was dispatching jazz bands around Asia to demonstrate to everybody that the American way of life is what they should really aspire to. And of course, open their airstrips to US warplanes. When Brubeck visited in 1958, Bombay's nightlife was picking up again. Though prohibition was still in force, a typically Indian loophole introduced in 1953 allowed people to drink if they obtained a permit from the excise department. These little white passes were available to visitors and to Indians who declared that they needed alcohol for the maintenance and preservation of their health. A surprising number of Bombay residents, it turned out, believed that the robustness of their constitutions depended on downing an occasional tot or two, and permit rooms sprang up around town to tend to their well being. Oh, yeah, that's because I haven't changed that much. That's Brubeck, and some of you may recognize some of the people in the picture. There's Mrs. Correa, Mickey Correa's wife in the sari. There's a chap called Hal Green looking over his shoulder, over her shoulder, and that's Paul Desmond and Dave Brubeck. Uh, there was also Abdul Halim Jafar Khan, who was at this event on Malabar Hill, but I don't think he's in that picture. Anyway, many of these permit rooms were to be found on the broad Churchgate Street extension, which lay between the railway station that we all know and Marine Drive. And it was a stretch so lively with jazz that many musicians insisted that it was exactly like the club line 52nd Street in New York that they'd read about in Downbeat. Nobody had actually ever visited the place. As you walk down from the station towards the Arabian Sea, you'd hear music, much of it jazz, coming out of Gaylords and Napoli and Bombaylis and Berries, and at the end, talk of the town. Smack in the middle of the street was the Ambassador Hotel, where Dizzy Sal was the reigning deity. The hotel, which was managed by a cigar chomping Greek named Jack Voyansis, had a bar and grill called Society. And on nights when it was full, Voyansis would try to persuade patrons to try the other room across the hall where there's music and dancing. And the name stuck. The menu at the other room featured Greek, Hungarian, Swiss, and Burmese dishes, but its main attraction was the music. The establishment's clientele soon included a great many glamorous, well-endowed women, and some musicians began to refer to it as the other room. Dizzy Sal had a stellar reputation. In 1957, Trend magazine, which sponsored a Sunday jazz program on Radio Ceylon, described him as India's top, perhaps only progressive jazz musician. The magazine helpfully explained that progressive jazz was the most modern and intellectual form of jazz. And as proof of this, the writer noted that Sal, a self-taught musician, wanted to write a book about composition. The article listed many virtues, Sal's many virtues. He could play 20 variations of a tune he'd only heard once before. He was soft-spoken and well-mannered, and other musicians considered him to be a phenomenon. The only personality flaw Trend considered to be important enough to mention in this article was Sal's habit of turning up very late for appointments. Edward Saldana had arrived in Bombay in 1954, responding to an advertisement by the venerable band leader Ken Mack seeking a pianist for a new group he was putting together. It was to have largely women, and it was going to have 3 men and a woman, and it was called 3 Hits and a Miss. The last being a reference to the gorgeous crooner, Miss Shirley Myers. When the young pianist walked through the door, Ken Mack looked at him and said, "You look just like Dizzy Gillespie. Your name is no longer Edward Saldana. From now it's Dizzy Sal." The pianist had been born in Rangoon, where his father owned a music shop, and his father had played the violin in orchestras accompanying silent films. Dizzy Sal was only 4 when he started picking out tunes on the piano. At 5, he performed on a children's program on Burma radio. When the Japanese invaded Burma in 1942, the Saldanas moved to Bangalore. The young Dizzy would spend long hours at movie theaters on South Parade, soaking in the soundtracks. His sister Maria remembers him returning one evening to reproduce all the numbers on the piano that he'd heard in Casablanca only a few hours before. As a game, his siblings would send him to the other room and strike notes on the piano. B flat, the boy would yell out as his brother William hit a key. F sharp. He was never wrong. Music so obsessed the youngster he had to be reminded to eat, his siblings said. By 13, he was leading his own combo, playing gigs in Bangalore and Mysore and Coorg. In Bombay, his job with 3 hits and a miss at the Ambassador didn't pay nearly quite enough to make the rent. So Sal also doubled up as a typist and a radio mechanic. Uh, he stayed with the group for just 2 years. Ken Mack was good to me, Sal told in an interview later. I left him because I had ambition. I didn't want to play dance music, sheet music. I wanted to play jazz. Dizzy Sal explained why he was mesmerized by jazz. It's got beat, it's got cohesion, it's spontaneous, he said. It's like a church service. Jazz forces cohesion between musicians and the people who listen to it. And people feel it. It isn't dead, repeated music, it's something happening, something alive. After he left Mac, Sal formed the Ambassador Quartet, spelt with a Quartette, very French, and so that he could indulge his passion for jazz. He'd play his own compositions and write arrangements for other bands. There's nothing else he wanted to do, his brother William said. He could play with the band until the restaurant closed, and after it did, he would get the lads together and jam until 4 in the morning. Every night it was the same thing. Music was his food. There was plenty to feast on when Dizzy Sal arrived in the US in the summer of 1959. Within days of getting there, the pianist found himself sharing a lunch table with Marshall Stearns, the Chaucer expert who taught a course in jazz history at New York University. Also in the dining room was the lanky saxophonist Ornette Coleman, who a few months later would throw the jazz world into tumult with his provocatively titled album called The Shape of Jazz to Come. Coleman had daringly chosen to record without any chordal instruments, working on the assumption that the absence of a piano or guitar would leave the musicians greater room for their improvisations. This avant-garde jazz style would soon come to be called free jazz. Coleman and Dizzy were students together at the Lennox School of Music, a summer school at a resort called Music Inn in the Berkshire Hills in Massachusetts, which was the ultimate master class for promising musicians. The school had been started 2 years earlier by John Lewis, the cerebral pianist and vibraphonist, who believed that jazz had got too esoteric to be learnt the old way, with young musicians apprenticing themselves to established names and acquiring their art by osmosis. Lewis thought that lectures and demonstrations by teachers drawn from the top ranks of jazz would be more effective in helping young, bright musicians carry the tradition forward. The ever generous Dave Brubeck arranged for Dizzy Sal to go to Lennox before he went off to Berklee. Like all the other students, Sal had been auditioned by tape for the prestigious 3-week program and had taken a short written exam. His 42 fellow students, drawn from 5 countries, included several of the most promising jazz musicians in the US, some of whom were already at Berklee, and others who were headed there the next month. In addition to the 29-year-old Ornette Coleman, there was a saxophonist from Maine named Ted Casher, with whom Dizzy Sal formed a firm friendship. Another participant in the program, Jack Underwood, would go on to become a member of the hip rock band The Mothers of Invention, formed by Frank Zappa. Sal took lessons in composition, jazz history, instrumental performance, and small ensemble playing. One set of photographs from the camp shows him sitting at the piano in a tent, jamming with the guitar player Jim Hall, one of the instructors in the small ensemble to which Sal had been assigned. Their other teacher was the pianist Bill Evans. It's obviously a hot day. For most of the students are in t-shirts. The bass player is actually bare-chested. Sal is the only person in long sleeves, but he is the very picture of cool as he plays the score in front of him. The calm of the photograph belies the ferociously innovative atmosphere that prevailed at Lennox. Bill Evans recalled, I had 11 piano students, and I would say 8 of them didn't even want to know about chords or anything. They didn't even want to know anything that anyone had done before them because they didn't want to be imitators. Each term at the Lennox School ended with a performance at which students performed their own compositions. Sal's chance came on August the 29th, 1959, when his cohort performed his composition, Relaxing at Music Inn, named for the establishment in which the training program was held. The tune was a tribute to the ebullient Stephanie Barber, who we see here, who owned the resort and who'd been instrumental in organizing the summer school. The show kicked off with the ensemble to which Ornette Coleman was attached. Sal came on later in the evening. He didn't seem to suffer from stage fright. That's clear from the record of the event that was released later. Though the album doesn't feature Sal's composition, archives believe that not all performances were recorded and that some of the bits of tape may be lost. But his piano can be heard on two other tracks. As his friend Ted Kasher noted, Sal's lines are crisp, his harmonies intriguing. Sal seemed determined to take complete advantage of the opportunity life had thrown at him. Let's listen to a section of it. And that's the first time we hear Dizzy Sal on tape. Sal moved to Boston the next month during his first semester at Berklee. He shared a basement apartment in this building, 290 Newbury Street, with the 21-year-old Ted Kasher, who was also studying music. He was also studying at the music college. And the music college was located down the street at 284 Newbury. Like the rest of the pack, Dizzy and I were broke most of the time, Kasher said. They'd go down to the First National store to buy cheap supplies, and he said that the Indian would cook him chicken curry. Their friend, the vibraphonist Gary McFarland, lived with his wife in an apartment across the street from Sal and Kasher, and sometimes Dizzy cooked for them too. Among the most memorable meals Kasher remembers eating in those hard-up times was a dish of roast beef and potatoes that they could afford after an especially lucrative gig. But Sal's culinary prowess, of course, was the least of it, and it wasn't a patch on his musical skills. Dizzy played piano like crazy, Ted Kasher said. He had a good harmonic sense and was a pretty good composer too. He could play good blues. Dizzy bought a Wurlitzer electric piano, an instrument that had been in production for only 4 years, and the roommates would sometimes practice together after class. In an attempt to graduate as quickly as possible, Sal was cramming in 2 years, two semesters worth of courses into a single term. He later told an interviewer, "I went through the learning and the teaching to get to the basic roots of mainstream jazz and to know what was happening around me. It was a goal, an ambition one has to pursue in life, a philosophy one has to have, not just waste and drift like other people, like sheep. As Kasha looked back on his friendship with Sal, his most vivid memories were Sal's religious streak. Every afternoon at noon, Dizzy Sal would attend Mass here at St. Cecilia's Church around the corner. It must have been an especially propitious shrine, since Cecilia, after all, is the patron saint of musicians. And a few weeks after studying at Berkeley, Sal had put together his own quartet. In November 1959, they were invited to play at the Bard Jazz Festival, which was organized by one of their classmates, the precocious pianist Rand Blake, at Bard College near New York City. Um, 4 years later, or 40 years later, Blake recalled when I interviewed him that he'd invited Sal to perform because Dizzy Sal, he said, was a talented musician with a fantastic sense of humor. Uh, that's a qualification. It's difficult to establish a detailed record of Assad's life in the US after this, but some moments stand out. In November 1959, Downbeat magazine reported that the clarinet player Tony Scott had offered him the piano chair on his forthcoming India tour, but Sal decided to make the most of his opportunity to study in the US. He played gigs at New York clubs such as the Half Note and the Hickory House, and even appeared on a TV show called Jazz with Father O'Connor, which was hosted by Father Norman James O'Connor, a Roman Catholic priest who served on the board of the Newport Jazz Festival. In May 1960, he went on to his first real record date as part of an ensemble put together by Ken McIntyre, an African American saxophonist and flute player who'd recently got a master's degree in composition from the Boston Conservatory. McIntyre was among the performers who wanted to take jazz in the direction that Ornette Coleman had marked out. And Downbeat described him as a musician who was unafraid of the unexpected and the unpredictable. Indeed, he appears to delight in exploiting it, it's said. When I decided to put together a version of this presentation a couple of years ago, I wondered if there was any new material about Dizzy Sal out there. And lo and behold, I stumbled upon a Facebook page about the trombone put together by the trombone player in this session, John Manseo Lewis, who later changed his name to Dawood Haroon. I sent the page a note on Facebook Messenger and received a reply an hour later. It had bad news. Unfortunately, Mr. Haroon had died only the year before, the reply said. But the message said, "My name is Salim. I run this page and his website. I would be more than happy to assist you in any way I can." And so Salim did. He sent me a whole bunch of photos of that recording session that I'd never seen before and which hadn't really been made public before. He also sent me Haroon's brief notes about the session. Evidently, the group had rehearsed for the better part of 1958 and 1959, sent the demo off, and then did the date for Prestige Records in the famous Englewood Cliffs studio in New Jersey in 1960. The reviewer in Downbeat magazine was very impressed by the album that they produced. He gave the album 4.5 stars, describing it as a unique and workable marriage of conventional and expressionist practices. Yet it is wholly personal, cogent, and an integrated approach with no loose ends, he said. And so let's listen to a section of this. Before that, let me, yeah. Each year, the Berklee School of Music issued a new records as part of a series it called Jazz in the Classroom. This was so that students could get a sense of how a recording studio worked, and they also had recording engineers who were taking courses, and so they could figure out how to use the soundboard. And Dizzy Sal features on this record, Volume 5. He and his classmates are playing arrangements of tunes composed by the saxophonist Benny Golson. Sal later described Golson as an accomplished musician who never quite received the fame he deserved. He could have been speaking about himself. By now, it's clear that the US wasn't turning out to be all that he'd hoped for. For one thing, money was desperately tight. After rooming with Ted Casher for a semester, he moved into cheaper digs. But it wasn't his strained circumstances that disappointed him as much as US musical culture. He had a lot of expectations, Ted Casher recalled. He expected jazz to be coming at him from every lamppost. But Sal had the misfortune of arriving in the US 4 years after a pudgy man with a kiss curl down his forehead had changed musical tastes forever. The kids were listening to Bill Haley and rock and roll, said Casher. Jazz gigs were hard to get. Though his head was still filled with memories of his triumphs in Bombay, Sal was an unknown in Boston, and he had to struggle all over again. When work did come Dizzy Sal's way, there were often indignities attached. The owners of Boston's Storyville nightclub, for instance, would agree to book him in only if he wore Indian clothes. The debonair Sal had probably never worn anything other than a sharply cut suit at his concerts in India, but he was desperate enough to agree. Since he didn't have his own Indian clothes, he had to hire robes from a costume store. Casher believes that Sal's timing was tragically wrong. Had he arrived a few years later, he could have taken advantage. Of being Indian and played what Ted Casher said. He could have become a raga player, sort of riding in the wake of the Beatles. He didn't graduate. Dave Brubeck, who had been keeping tabs on the Indian musician, recalled only that Dizzy Sal was unable to continue his studies because he got disoriented. When Sal was in the US, he had kept in touch with his family with letters that were only occasional. Phones were still very rare in India, and international trunk calls were prohibitively expensive. One day in 1962, his brother William, who had since moved to Kuwait, was startled when a friend knocked at his door and said, "Guess who I have here with me?" And there in Kuwait was Dizzy Sal. He had no suitcase, no passport, and no explanations. His family, when I interviewed them, continued to be puzzled by Dizzy Sal's abrupt return. "We are Catholics and we're not supposed to believe in such things," the sister said, but some of his closest associates said there was an element of black magic. He was too good to handle, and there was considerable jealousies from his fellow musicians. He returned to India shortly after. In 1967, he gave concerts in Bombay, Delhi, and Bangalore, playing a program of tunes from Hollywood and Broadway. He also played a stint at the Taj Mahal in Bombay, but Dizzy Sal didn't enjoy that engagement. He was unhappy with the prospect of playing music in the foyer, he told a journalist. When I left the States, most musicians were playing regularly in dance bands. When I came back, all that had changed. Pop music was taking over. The pianist moved to the family home in Bangalore and became a recluse. One story suggests that he'd become embarrassed because he had contracted the disfiguring disease of leukoderma. When it appeared in his forearms, he pulled his sleeves down and kept playing. When it spread to his neck, he was willing to perform in a scarf. But when it spread to his face, he shut himself away in the house at Richmond, in the house in Richmond Town, and refused to go on stage again. If you went by at night, the fans whispered, you would hear magical music fill the street. Sal's siblings confirmed that the musician was sick for many years, both with leukoderma and with Parkinson's disease, which left him unable to play the instrument he loved so much, and which he traveled all the way to America to master. He died on July the 25th, 1998. When I interviewed Ted Kasher in 2010, he said it had been decades since he had received news of Dizzy Sal. Over the phone line from Mansfield, Massachusetts, he offered a possible explanation for why Dizzy Sal had left the US. He got himself some mental problems, Ted Kasher said. Evidently, Dizzy Sal, the devout Roman Catholic and daily mass goer, fell in love with a girl named Jill and couldn't reconcile himself to what Ted Kasher said was their sinful relationship. It drove him crazy, Kasher said. He attempted to cut his nose off. Sal had to be put in an institution but stayed awake all night hearing voices. After he was discharged, he left the US. These are sections from his diary. Kasher's voice quavered when I told him that Dizzy Sal had died a few years before. Oh, my poor friend, he sighed. We'd enjoyed ourselves plenty. I feel sorry that he came to such a pass. And that then is the story of Dizzy Sal. Thanks for listening. Happy? Why did they think that it's based in the blues, boss? I'll take questions if anybody has one. If you're throwing tomatoes, I'll try to catch them. All right, thanks. Let's go listen to the Stuti choir.
Before you all go off, just thank you very much for that. But I think as the last session and the closing session, I'd also like to thank all the people behind the scenes, the students, the nameless students who've been running around and making sure this goes off very well, and our technicians in this room inside who've been working to make sure that the whole thing goes off very smoothly. Thank you all.